Welcome to Dear Diaspora, a podcast celebrating the African diaspora and the changemakers, innovators, and entrepreneurs working to make our world a better one to live in. I'm your host, Andile Masuku. Let's get started. So before I introduce the next guest, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review if you're listening on Apple Podcasts. It makes a huge difference. And one key way that it helps is if someone looks up Dear Diaspora on Apple Podcasts, they can see the ratings, they can see reviews and what other people think of the show, and it makes them more likely to actually subscribe and check out a couple episodes. So be sure to leave a review. I would really appreciate it. And if you're listening on any other podcast listening platform, don't forget to make sure you're following the podcast so that you are updated each time there's a new episode out every Sunday. And also, if you're listening on Spotify, you can share when you're listening to episodes on your Instagram stories, which is really cool. So just like you would share a song, you can also share a podcast. So if you do that, go ahead and tag Dear Diaspora. So just at Dear Diaspora on Instagram, and I will repost and really appreciate you spreading the word about the podcast. Thank you so much for tuning into episode 13 of Dear Diaspora. I can't believe we're already at 13 episodes, and I also can't believe it's November already. Time flies and just goes by so fast. But anyway, I am super excited to introduce my next guest. So I had the pleasure of interviewing one of my favorite podcasters, Andile Masuku. Andile is the co-founder of African Tech Roundup. And African Tech Roundup is a Johannesburg-based media and insights organization which tracks the progress of Africa's emerging digital, tech, and innovation industries. It's really how I stay plugged in to just all things, tech and, startup-wise, and just, innovation and just really cool things happening on the continent. So if you're not subscribed to African Tech Roundup, please do so and check it out. It's such a great podcast. So during the episode, we discussed what sparked his interest in technology, his upbringing in Zimbabwe, and his life now living in South Africa, his thoughts on the Mara Group. So they are behind the first cell phone to be totally manufactured in Africa. So I get his thoughts on that, and just also what he thinks about China's presence on the continent, and all the technology that they are deploying on the continent, and just all their their moves on the continent. I got to just pick his brain about what he thinks about that. So I really enjoyed this conversation. If you are interested at all in African tech and innovation, this is definitely the episode for you. And if you know anyone else that is really super interested in this sort of content, please share this episode with them. Andile, thank you so much for being a guest on Dear Diaspora. I'm so excited to have you.
It's an absolute pleasure.
Yes, thank you for being on the show. I am a huge fan of your podcast, African Tech Roundup. It's one of the first podcasts I came across that just covered, just what's happening as far as innovation and technology goes on the continent. So I've learned a lot from it. And so thank you for that. So I wanted to,
and that's music to my ears. So you're part of the village.
Yes, totally. And so I wanted to get to know you a little bit more. And so I always start by asking, where did you grow up? And what was it like for you growing up in Zimbabwe? I know you were born there. And then I know that you also recently moved to South Africa. So I'd love to also hear about that.
Look, the older you get, the more, I suppose, sentimental you become about your upbringing, especially if you've been as blessed as I have to be raised by, both parents who, in my humble opinion, have done an excellent job at creating an enabling environment for my brothers and I to grow up and, find our strengths and, launch into the world. So So forgive me if I'm a little, if I'm a little sentimental, but I mean, for the most part, especially when I trade notes with other people who've had far less privilege in their lives, I realize every day just how blessed I was to be born in 1984 in a sort of post-independence Zimbabwe. Things hadn't quite properly settled down yet completely. I mean, there were still pockets of struggle in the country, and of course, yeah, it's a difficult history for Zimbabwe, no doubt. I was born, around about the time I was born, but born in Bulawayo, my hometown. Shout out to you, Skies, Blues. I see you, fam. And so I'm born there. 18 months later, my family moves to Harare, the capital city of Zimbabwe. And then I would spend 8 years of my life there before my family moved to the Philippines, where we spent 3 years before returning to Zimbabwe, where I went back to school, finished high school, and then left to study for a business degree at Helderberg College in the Western Cape, not too far from Cape Town in South Africa. Thereafter, I moved to Johannesburg and chose to stay there. And most of my professional career is rooted there.
Wow. And so what was it like going to school in the Western Cape?
Well, going to school in the Western Cape, sure. So my father studied for his master's degree at the same institution. And he studied there at a time when, Black folk were only allowed in certain places. When for the duration of the time he spent at Helderberg College, he wasn't allowed on the beach, which you can actually see from the campus, because it's at the foot of a mountain that sort of overlooks the beautiful Strand Beach in that. And so the whole time my father would have studied at Helderberg College, he would never have been allowed on that beach. And so
wow.
It was quite, it's quite moving to think that many years later I'd be studying at the same institution and allowed to freely walk that beach and enjoy it with everyone else. And then the sad irony, of course, is that the only time I've ever been called the N word to my face, I suppose there's a K word in South Africa, kafa, which is the equivalent to the N word in the US. The only time I've ever been called that word to my face was on that beach, Wow. So there's, I share that anecdote just to give you a sense of just how, things tend, in many ways things changed, and the world I was privileged to enjoy university and was so much different to the world my father had to study in. But in many ways, some things don't change.
Seriously. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's quite an interesting perspective. So thank you for sharing that with me and the audience. And so I guess was it an easy decision for you to move to actually relocate to South Africa as a professional because you went to school there?
So, yeah, I mean, by the time I finished my 4-year degree, I was pretty certain I wanted to stay in South Africa. In fact, at the time, I was pretty certain I wanted to stay in Cape Town, which is funny because I wouldn't want to live in Cape Town now. But yeah, no, it was a pretty easy decision. Zimbabwe at the time, I mean, this is circa, 2006 odd, So, I mean, if anyone who knows about Zimbabwe's more recent history will know that, 2006, 7, 8 especially, were just really tough years economically, politically for the country. And so no one in their right mind, at least at my age, 2021 at the time, would have wanted to return home and struggle through that. And so, yeah, I walked into my first job, which was a teaching role at a private Christian school, and this was my attempt to escape what I sensed would be, the career path my parents would would enable me to access in Zimbabwe via their connections. They're very, well connected there as educators, as people who've spent most of their lives in Zimbabwe. I was probably going to be shooed into a decent sort of corporate role in Zimbabwe, doing something I didn't really want to do or wasn't passionate about. And so spending a year teaching sounded like a great way to spend my professional, energies until I figured out what it was I did want to do, which again, I have to be humble to the fact that I don't think I've ever had anything be as difficult to do professionally as teaching before or since that experience. And so, yeah, that was a baptism of fire. I thought I was just going to sort of hang out for a year and then sort of figure myself out. But no, I was in for what would be, I think, one of the biggest challenges of my young professional life. Thankfully, it didn't last too long. My work permit didn't clear, and I eventually left that school before, before I could even start the second term. So it was just really 3 months of teaching, which taught me a lot. But then that led me to the next thing and the next thing. And before I knew it, I was sort of like a Joburg native. And yeah, the rest, as they say, is history, I guess.
Very cool. And so what would you say, or when did you start being really interested in like technology? Like what sparked that interest?
It's a good question. I suppose the assumption for someone who, happens upon the African Tech Roundup podcast in 2019 might be that I am this tech head who just, is inherently in love with technology and innovation and that kind of thing. And it's not that I'm not. It's just, I think, firstly, I'm just a really curious person, and I'm more fascinated with stories and how stories evolve. And I think technology has just become one of the biggest or most important proxies for how stories are told, how stories are perpetuated and broadcast, who gets to hear stories, who gets to tell them, who gets to participate in economic activity, who gets left out. And so from that standpoint, there's so much to be curious about and so much to be interested about in that space. And it's more that than it is, I grew up playing Game Boys and, I was that kid who opened up, like, every time we got a toy, I'd open it up and see how it works inside. I was never that kid. And growing up, yes, to be fair, I mean, my parents probably had one of the only computers in the neighborhood when I was a toddler, that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, I would not sort of point to that experience as being how I was put onto technology. I remember that computer for the most part staying off the whole time because I do come from an African house, an African home, a traditional African home, and that was Daddy's computer, and it only turned on when, he said so, and then eventually my older brother had permission to turn it on once in a while. And for the most part, it just stayed off, right? So no, it wasn't, but then I also, now that I reflect, we got television in our home pretty late. My parents visited the US on a trip and returned with a television set in 1990. I'll never forget that. And so perhaps the most influential technology in my life as a child would have been the television, and my fascination with this box and the voices that came from it and the pictures I saw there, and my fascination with how things got to be in the box, and who else had a box, and how cool it was to compare what other people had in their box, and you know what I mean, and there were places places I could go and watch things in boxes that I wasn't allowed to watch in our box. And, so from that standpoint, television and perhaps technology, even communications technology, is probably what got me going.
Okay. Yeah. And so, so when did you, I know you said you didn't necessarily grow up like a techie, but as you kind of grew like in your professional life, when did you decide to like you're the co-founder of African Tech Roundup, like how did you meet the other co-founder, and what kind of drove you guys to starting the podcast?
So prior to launching the podcast, I had a pretty successful television career on screen and, behind the scenes, working in television in South Africa for what was then one of the most, what was the biggest sort of small business advice show. So this is before sort of Shark Tank and Dragon's Den became a big deal, at least in South Africa. They probably just launched in the US. And so I was on the show, and I'd already sort of broken into media, and yeah, I was feeling really good about myself and feeling really, I was sort of buying into the notion of being well known and being a celebrity and having, the privileges that come with that and a comfortable income, that kind of thing. Just feeling really self-satisfied. And the show I was working on at the time got cancelled. It was sponsored by a bank that basically paid all the bills, and so the production company that made the show didn't want to tick off the bank by taking the title to some other bank or to some other network, and so I was left in the wilderness, and that's when it kind of hit me for the first time just how, relatively speaking, dispensable I was as a talent, as a media person, and particularly as someone who didn't own the rights to and control the brand I was working on. And so, yeah, that was a rude awakening. And I suppose at the time I assumed, the next thing is just going to come along, and the next thing kind of didn't come along. And the things I was being offered at the time just didn't match what I was leaving behind or, what had just ended. And yeah, I went through a very humbling period where I sort of had to go back to, I sort of had to rediscover my personal passions and my personal sense of purpose around, why I was in the position I was, the privilege of it, the gift of it, the responsibility of it, and then also just figure out for myself what I actually enjoyed doing. As it happens, I didn't really enjoy being on television. I never have. I've never really enjoyed, I don't enjoy the makeup. I enjoy like being the highest paid person in the crew, having the lights on me and pressure and forcing the smile. And I've just never enjoyed that. And as a child who had a speech impediment, television is actually the most stressful version of being a media person for me, because I totally have to bring a personality or a persona to screen in order to override what is essentially a child who used to stutter, Wow. And so television is really, really stressful. And and given the opportunity, I wouldn't do television, certainly wouldn't do it unless, I was doing something I really enjoyed or, that really mattered. And that show didn't really matter. And it wasn't really something I cared about deeply. Like I said, I'm a curious person. So I generally find, fun in doing a lot of different things. But at the point, 4 years into that show, I wasn't having fun anymore. It was a formula. I was comfortable, and it wasn't really, it wasn't giving me the latitude to grow as a person, none of that. So anyway, so all of this you start to reflect on all of this once the gig is over. And then you realize, well, the one thing I do really enjoy is, one thing I've always been blessed with is a voice. And I'm a classically trained singer. I'm not the most amazing out there. I definitely need the training to be good enough to be heard in public. But I've always enjoyed the voice as it's always been my go-to for how I express and how I enjoy being seen. So, dancers obviously enjoy the physicality of what they do, or people who, makeup artists obviously enjoy, especially people who make up their own faces, enjoy sort of using their own faces as a platform for expressing, fashion designers enjoy fashion. I have always enjoyed the voice and using it and, manipulating it and tuning it, and not just mine, but other people's as well. And so that's kind of how, voiceover work had always been some of the most enjoyable work I did in media. And then I was like, yeah, but I'd never worked in radio. I'd never really done anything meaningful in radio or anything like that. Had done some news reading and things like that, but nothing like, podcasting. And podcasting was kind of nascent at the time. And it was like, wow, you can really just be yourself on a mic. And if yourself isn't good enough, you can edit it. And it was just a fascinating medium for me as a stuttering child, remember, who recovered stuttering child to discover, it was the first media platform that allowed me to be myself in a way that other things hadn't or wouldn't, so that's how I came to podcasting. And then the sort of tech thing was, I met a guy who, he had like a lot of tech enterprise experience. And yeah, he'd started like a publication, a newsletter that, that was serving, people of color, predominantly Africans, who just never had a voice before within the context of tech and innovation, and even enterprise tech and startups, certainly, and investments in the space and stuff. And it was a really popular newsletter, and I'd seen him do this. His name was Dear Diaspora. And I approached him and I was like, look, I've got the broadcasting chops. I've got, I'm really curious about the space. I'm interested enough, and I see what you have here. You have this amazing community and a deep understanding of the space. And what if you and I started a podcast together? And he agreed. Some years after that, we parted ways. He carried on with his platform. I carried on with the African Tech Roundup, and I later sort of hooked up with my Zambian co-founder, Musa Kalenga, who has is in the trenches with me now. So that's the, I suppose, the long, sort of short version. Yeah.
Wow. And so like how, so where are like the majority of your listeners? I'm curious about that, because I feel like I've, like during the episode, sometimes you're like, oh, to my listeners in the West, or to my listeners here. So it's awesome to see that you, or to hear that you have like such a global reach, but like where are your listeners, and like how big is African Tech Roundup?
Right. So remind me where you are.
I'm in the U.S., Kansas City, Missouri.
Kansas City, Missouri. Okay, so the U.S. is our single largest audience, and the U.S. and Europe combined make up at least 2/3 of our audience, of our weekly audience. Wow. And yeah, so in order of size, our biggest audiences would be the U.S., South Africa, the U.K., Kenya, and Nigeria, in that order. But cumulatively, our audience abroad makes up, like I said, 2/3 of our audience. So I think it's probably safe to say that the vast majority of the people who listen to the show are either diasporans or Africa-focused founders, investors, academics, policymakers who rely on us to be a window to the ecosystem in a way that perhaps they find really hard to solve for any other way. And so, in a way, it's that dynamic's partly why we're a going concern today. It's, we didn't set out to be, this window to the world. We actually set out to be a for us by us situation where, we don't have a voice here. We want to be part of the agenda setting dispensation. We want to be involved. We want our take to factor in not just all the well-heeled, well-PR'd voices and institutions that typically get to project into the rest of the world about Africa. We want to be part of it, and so this dynamic's actually what had put us in a position to sort of I want to be careful here, to be a sustainable commercial proposition, right?
Got
to be a
it.
sustainable commercial proposition. And that's simply because the reality is, ears in more developed nations, particularly in the global West, are just are more valuable to advertisers, and are certainly some of the most valuable audiences to influence and to be able to access reliably and influence reliably. And so that's obviously not a dynamic I'm excited about. It's a dynamic that I'd definitely like to see change over time, where listeners and audiences, viewers, certainly in the video context on the African continent, should and can and should be just as valuable as audiences anywhere in the world. But the reality is, if you're building a media business of any kind, those sort of pragmatic factoids do play into the conversation. And so, yeah. And the unfortunate truth as well is that a lot of what plays out on the African landscape within the tech and innovation ecosystem is influenced and driven by overseas interests. And so there's a pragmatic need for us to influence their thinking and their agendas, and sort of impose basically our will and our needs and our desires onto them, and let them know that they can't just come here and do whatever they want. And so, yeah, I'm answering your question in a long-winded fashion, which is typical. But yeah, so most of our audience is abroad, is based abroad. We have no way of knowing, we haven't polled our audience in any sort of meaningful fashion. So I can't tell you what percentage of it might be sort of a diasporan audience. Mm. But my sense is that, a fair, at least 30 to 40% of our audience would be diasporans who are looking to keep tabs on and or be actively involved in some meaningful way with what's going on the continent.
I would say that describes me. So I'm sure there are a lot of people similar to me that, were either like born back home, or maybe they're like first generation, like Americans, and they're just curious about, what's happening on the continent.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I can tell you right now that our most engaged audiences, I use as a measure of that, like our most engaged audiences on social media, our most engaged audiences via our newsletter, the extent to which we can actually see who's listening via, SoundCloud, because, certain people actually have accounts there. Our most engaged audiences are definitely Africans and African diasporans. Mm. So yeah, that's definitely really important to us, and it's quite validating. What I can tell you holistically as well, which is again, a fact, something for nothing, is it's overall a very affluent audience. People are streaming. Yeah, people are streaming. By and large, they're not downloading content. They're mostly streaming it from high-end Apple and Android devices. That we can tell. And yeah, so it's also kind of humbling to acknowledge just how, privileged anyone who can listen to a podcast is, particularly if they're African. And also, I think that comes with responsibility that we don't necessarily represent the everyday African if we're into podcasts at all and listen to them on a regular basis. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so that's the thing that, always, at first it used to sort of really bug me to the point of maybe there are other things that I could do that would be more inclusive and more impactful. And until I sort of realized pragmatically that those with the privilege are probably those who need to be influenced first and most vociferously initially. And then, hopefully as we sort of unlock the means, we start to serve the masses. Once sort of the vision has caught fire properly, in those who will wield that fire, with responsibility, because otherwise, privilege will do its thing. It's typically never in the favor of, everyone who doesn't have it,
And I would love to kind of transition into some more, I guess, like tech related questions. Some of my audience expressed an interest in discussing the new smartphones that are being like manufactured in Rwanda with the Mara Group. Have you been following that? And I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on that.
Yes, I have been following that development, and I'm excited. I'm as excited as any sort of good African should be that our sense of what's possible has been shifted by that development. If you're like me, growing up in Zimbabwe, you grew up just believing certain things weren't for you, just because you'd never seen Black folk execute on that, or you'd never seen them done in your country. And so I suppose, there's a generation of children who are going to grow up knowing that, you can have a smartphone factory in your town, and an entire smartphone you have in your pocket can be created without needing too many things from outside the African continent. I think that does a lot for a child's psyche, but also the collective African psyche. So that's on the idealistic, hopeful side of things. And then on the sort of pragmatic side of things, I hope the success lasts long enough for us to enjoy it and to see it sort of go from one generation to the next, because there are two reasons why, if you're skeptical or even cynical, you look at this and go, this isn't going to work, or this isn't something I want to get too attached to. Firstly, I mean, there's Southeast Asia, namely China, and their sort of global monopoly on manufacturing, especially in the electronic space, right? It's a near monopoly. I mean, yes, there's Korea and there's other people, but it's a near monopoly. And so when you think about sort of where Africa potentially, and I say this, Africa's corporately and maybe Rwanda specifically, where it fits in the scheme of things within a global context, you wonder if there's any real competitive chance for a country like Rwanda to get in on the action. And then there's the other side of things where you're like, well, are we too late to the party? Is this playing into a narrative where Africa becomes the next sort of, factory of the world, the next China, as China becomes richer and wealthier and doesn't want to do all this sort of dirty, dusty work anymore? Is Africa where it's going to be? And is it going to happen in the same way China did it, in a mostly environmentally unfriendly and, environmentally degrading way? Is that the price we're going to need to pay in order to, participate in global economics? Then there's the other way you could look at it, where you're like, well, perhaps this is also like a signal, a signaling occurrence that points to how, African nations are going to increasingly start thinking about their national interest before they put, global realities or their relationships with global entities before they take those into consideration. And I say this to mean Rwanda is, for better or for worse, and I mean, it's got its, that their current president has his fans and his detractors, and for better or for worse, Rwanda is sort of making a name for what it looks like when an African nation puts itself before anyone else. on the global stage, so will you, the America says, oh, we're going to dump sort of used clothes on you. Rwanda says no. Or, people come to the country and say, we want to operate, or we want to start startups, or we want to just pour sort of investment in this space. And the government says, nah, you need to deal with us before you do anything in the private space. We're not an entirely open economy for you to do whatever you want. And so, yeah, maybe this is a trend that's signaling how the rest of the continent might start to try and look for ways to position as self-sufficient as, putting our citizens' interests first before the rest of the world. And maybe this is a symbolic step in that direction. But yeah, that's me trying to 360 it. I just let you into my world, into how my mind works when I'm sort of prepping. If this topic ends up on the African Tech Roundup, this is typically how I'll sort of try and 360 it in my own mind, and then obviously, take it to my team and my co-hosts, and, we break it down and try and sort of figure out, how all the ways we can look at this without being sort of swept away by excitement, or without being overly cynical, or without looking like we're trying to raid on someone's parade, or without looking like we're too ready to declare a savior. And I think somewhere in the midst of all that is the way I think everyone should be thinking, which is, look, oversimplification is the enemy. I think we all just need to spend more time considering how all of these different things are interacting with each other, and perhaps true at the same time to varying degrees.
Wow. And I would say, that's what I love about like your show. Like, you approach each like headline or topic with like lots of nuance, and you share like different perspectives, and it's not just like, we hate this, we love this, this is good, like that sort of thing. So I really do appreciate that. And I feel like with the smartphone thing, like I did some like reading up on it, and they did say that they are actually going to be like opening a plant in Durban as well, and like they plan to employ like 200 people, with like 60% women and like over 90% youth, which I thought was pretty cool, because I'm like, well, at least in like the short term, they're people have jobs, young people especially, who typically don't have too much access to like formal employment opportunities. At least they, are going to have something. And like you said, I hope it lasts as well, and I hope people support it. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see where like the Mara group's going to be like in the next 10 years or so.
So that's interesting. Like, when you say you hope people support it, I hope it'll be good. I hope they'll make good phones that people want, so that it won't be a hard sell. It won't need to be, let's back brand Africa, I also hope that the unit economics of that particular business will hold up, so that it's not just it's not a business that relies entirely on sort of political connections, or certain incentives that they may or may not receive from governments in order to survive, and things of that nature, which I understand are part of what make many of the world's biggest businesses thrive. But I mean, one hopes that this thing grows and thrives on merit. That it has like proper mainstream appeal, that it has proper mainstream utility. In the same way, I always think of a brand like Stadler. I don't know if you know Stadler pencils and pens, and they're a German brand. Okay. They're found all over the world. You might have used one unwittingly and didn't know. I think they're typically red and black pencils. Striped.
Yes. Yep. I've used one, or used.
You've used one, and I think most people who've ever used a pencil, at least some point in their lives, have used the Stadler pencil, and for me, that's that company, when you read up on it, I encourage anyone listening and you yourself, I mean, go research that company, how it's run, how it's, you know, how it's stayed in private hands, how it stayed relevant, but also, you know, how it's, you know, continued to manufacture in Germany despite, you know, most pencils in the world being produced in China nowadays. I mean, it's just, it's just a fascinating case study to me of how, you know, an old school case study of how, you know, to think about building a business that will last a generation or more. And I think those are the kind of fundamentals that I hope, you know, businesses like Mara, the Mara Group, or anyone on the African continent integrates into their businesses, even just in terms of thinking or rhetoric, you know, so that, you know, we don't facilitate a culture of profiteering or like creating value, you know, or looking to capture value without actual value being created, you know. And I think on the flip side of that discussion, and the reason I'm going into it with such passion and perhaps, you know, speaking so long on it is because, you know, we have a Jumia at play, or at least on the demise at the moment, that I think is the embodiment of what happens when we don't apply our minds sufficiently and prudently to these matters.
Wow. I mean, that was like the perfect segue, because I did have some notes on Jumia and I wanted to ask you a couple questions about them. And so, like, for those that don't know, is Jumia essentially wants to be like the Amazon, right, of, let's say, like Nigeria or West Africa or the entire continent?
No. If you ask them, they are the Amazon. Well, okay, to be fair, they might not have sort of called themselves that, but yes, they've definitely been touted as the Amazon of Africa. And it's not a moniker they've sort of shied away from. They're just like, oh, yes, we're the biggest sort of e-commerce player on the continent. We're here for everybody. And so, yeah, they made a splash by sort of listing on the New York Stock Exchange and selling the world this idea that Africa had finally arrived, you know. And that was so annoying for so many reasons. And yeah, I mean, I don't have time to go into each of them. But firstly, Jumia is backed by, you know, foreign interests. It was founded by, you know, foreign players. And yes, they enlisted sort of local co-founders, quote unquote, to help run the business and launch it, and, you know, at varying points in their history. But they also, you know, spread themselves rather thinly across the continent, opening up offices and buying up smaller businesses in different geographies so that they could present this notion that they're in 27 plus odd countries or whatever it is.
Wow.
And, you know, so that, yeah, they could basically legitimately claim that they're sort of this pan-African business, which technically they are, but in real terms, in almost every market, they have a competitor that does better than them. That story also oversimplifies just what it takes to succeed across different markets on the African continent, because countries are so different, you know? And so there are just so many problematic reasons why, you know, it annoyed me and a lot of other people that these people would go, would sort of drag brand Africa into the world, claiming that they were both, I suppose, the next best thing since sliced bread on the continent, from the continent, and that they were positioning as the most bankable sort of startup unicorn, even by valuation, to invest in, when, yeah, like, they're actually a very shockingly run, you know, business that's, you know, losing money and mired in all sorts of controversies and yeah, they're just not the best ambassadors for what our ecosystem is capable of producing, sustaining, and certainly what we aspire to putting forward as our sense of, or our contribution on the world stage. And so that's Jumia, the way I see it. And so, yeah, the proof is, in this particular case, it's a situation of far quickly than even I would have anticipated. the reality of just how difficult a time they're having at running a business is catching up with them, and sort of reflected in their share price, which has tanked far below the highs that they initially posted when they first launched on the stock exchange. And yeah, it's become a huge embarrassment. And what I once posted, I think on social media, even said in an interview at the time was, just how readily are we as Africa going to be to embrace the fact that Africa is losing? I was challenging people who are just embracing the story as, oh, you wet blankets, you guys just don't want to see Jumia shine, or if this was a South African startup or an Egyptian startup and not a Nigerian startup, people would be more loving of it. And I'm like, no, this isn't about us sort of trying to to down our Nigerian brothers because that's where Jumia was spawned. This is just trying to be prudent about who gets to say what about brand Africa and who gets to assert a narrative about our ecosystem. And Jumia is just not the one. However hard and well PR'd they are, I refuse to identify with them as a poster child for our ecosystem, or the best of it anyway. Right.
Wow. Thank you for that. And what would you say they could have done right or done better? Like, do you think they just try to, scale too fast? Like, should they have just focused on Nigeria, gotten that like market together, and then maybe try to like expand into other countries? Like, what do you think they could have done differently?
Well, I think the problem starts far before what they did, like in sort of tactical terms, once the business was going. I'm laughing at myself here because I'm so predictable sometimes. I have concerns with the prevailing doctrine of venture capital that has been sold to the world by and large by Silicon Valley, and essentially this model creates a dynamic where people are rewarded, and by people I mean founders, investors are rewarded. There's a system that allows people to be rewarded to sort of make investments of time and money, and make profitable exits, whether or not real value has been created or indeed a real sustainable business has been created. And so it's a system that emphasizes hype and rewards whoever tells the best story and is able to sell it well. It's a system that also leverages very heavily on privilege, and by that I mean there are people who have the privilege of being able to use who they are or where they're from and their background or where they went to college to spin new ideas into existence and exit them before they have to deal with whether or not they were sustainable or good ideas to begin with. And I say this carefully because I think they're good ideas that should. I don't want to sound like I don't believe in people taking risks and the whole idea of being venture backed and people, there being a genre of money and investors who want to invest in untested, untried things. I think that should be there, but I think there's a sub-genre there's a subset of people in that space who know full well that the vast majority of ideas that are spawned in that space are by design never designed to be good businesses or sustainable ones or profitable ones. And they know full well that they're foolish people who are on the other side of when they've exited, who are going to have to bear the brunt of bad decisions and imprudent decisions. And they know full well often when they go in. And so, what does this have to do with Jumia? Well, I'm sure a lot of the people who launched Jumia were integrous and had like reasonable hopes that they would create the next Amazon of Africa. But I think at some point in that journey, it became apparent that the journey wasn't going to be as smooth or as straightforward as they had sold even their investors or themselves. And so IPOing was essentially their sort of last hope of exiting, before, the entire ship sank, with something to, so, with a success they could at least point to with, as, hey, look, Africa can produce, huge exits, put in this tiny little sum, spend a ton in between, but then you exit for a ton, and, you know what I mean? Africa does work. You see, African VC does work. And there's some people who backed Jumia for that very reason. It was this opportunity to show the world that, African venture capital was a true asset class, and, Jumia was going to be the proof. And I guess what I'm saying is I don't think it's right to sort of try and prove that point at any cost. And Jumia was just the wrong horse to back to try and prove that point to the world. And I think a lot of them knew it. A lot of the people involved with the company at varying points in its history knew at some point that there were some structural or sort of foundational issues with the business model, how quickly it could actually deliver value at scale, and to what extent the story they had sold investors to land the inordinate sums of money they've so far been able to raise. At some point, someone in the middle of a raise, pitching someone, knew full well that they would be taking this money and there was no plausible way for it to return. Never mind return with a decent margin. So that's what I think of Jumia. I think, you're asking me to go tactical in their team. See, I think they've been great people who have come in and out of work that business. I don't think the people who've worked the trenches of that business are stupid or naive. I think there are far too many smart people who've worked in the trenches of that business for me to assume that I can sit here and sort of, with the benefit of hindsight, go, oh, they should have done that tactically. I'm like the whole system that they were leveraging, and at some point, by my estimation, counting on to save them, even if the business didn't turn out to be a viable one at scale. For me, that's where that's what I don't vibe with. That's what makes me mad when I think about it.
And so something that I did come across when doing some research is like a lot of like logistics companies and things on the continent have like last mile delivery issues, getting the product to like the actual like customer. Is that something that you are like, you've done like some research on, or, are just interested in? Because that's like fascinating to me, because compared to the US, I feel like the US, we don't really have those sort of challenges, because it's easy for us. Like everyone, has their set address, and we have like, like the postal service is reliable, and it's not hard typically to get a package to like a customer. But I know that's something that's like a challenge in many like areas back home. And so do you have like some thoughts on that, and maybe like opportunities for people to maybe sort of come up with some sort of solution that would kind of aid that issue?
I think firstly there's a misnomer that the only kind of e-commerce that exists in the world is the one where you jump on a website, you order something, and it gets delivered to your house. That's the first thing I need to say. And then there's also the assumption that everyone on the African continent with access to an internet connection and the disposable income to make such an order is desperately trying to do so, and so frustrated with the last mile problem that they're sort of just praying for someone to come up with a solution. So you see that, I mean, both, and these are often the departure points where a lot of people I hear discuss this problem, you know. I am not saying that e-commerce a la how it works in the US is not a thing or a growing trend or something, you know, worth investing in on the African continent, or that Africans don't want a version of that kind of e-commerce. That's not what I'm saying. I am, however, saying that life seems to go on pretty well in most places I visited on the African continent without that version of e-commerce at play.
Okay.
At the same time, there's a version of e-commerce that, you know, that is happening unbeknownst to a lot of people, that involves, a more creative, perhaps more market relevant use of the internet, social media platforms, formal and informal networks. And so there's an interesting dynamic. So if you're into e-commerce at all, I feel like that's something to have, to take a closer look at. What sort of dynamics relevant to the Africa corporately, but certainly to certain African markets? What e-commerce trends are unique to the African continent? And really, that question put another way: how are everyday Africans doing business? How are they trading? How are they sending money to each other? How are they lending money to each other? How are they sort of paying for stuff? What are their preferences in that regard? How are they using platforms that perhaps were never initially designed for that purpose to hack a system that, is perhaps many years in some places away from giving them the sort of smooth, delivery experience that you enjoy when you order on Amazon in Kansas City, And so between the future where Africa sort of mirrors that reality, between now and that future, I mean, there is literally trillions of dollars worth of value to extract and sort of solving those problems if you're asking the right questions, if you're not presupposing that your version of quote unquote e-commerce is what Africa needs, and if you take the posture of trying to learn and understand. Because, I mean, I'll take Zimbabwe as an example. I mean, it's a really tough economic situation. But guess what? People are still sending money home. How are they doing it? What are their preferred means? What are they being taxed by remittance services or the government or whoever in order to do that? What are some of the ways that they're solving for that in order to minimize losses? What tools and platforms have they been are people using to store value, to try and hedge against any of the uncertainty they see? How do they get things? How do people with the money, but without the ease of means to get it to them? How are they solving for? How are the wealthy of Zimbabwe solving for ensuring that they have their favorite brand of butter or the new Prada bag or the latest Ferrari? How are they solving for it? To what extent is there anything to learn from that? And I think that's the way to approach e-commerce on the continent. And so from that standpoint, I mean, the whole last mile thing, which is just been talked to death. Yes, we have no streets. Yes, we have no roads in places. Yes, there are many informal settlements. Yes, but I don't know that too many people are lying in their huts in the middle of sort of rural Zimbabwe going, oh my word, who's going to solve the last mile problem,
Totally. And I really, really appreciate that perspective. And I really, I don't want to come off as like, oh, what works in the US should work back home, because we, consumers have the same wants and desires. Like that's not what I want to do, but I just wanted to get your perspective.
No, I understand. I don't think you're wrong to ask the question. I just think I'm speaking on behalf as someone who's sort of read 1,000 think pieces, attended, seen many people wax lyrical in keynote addresses. I've seen people sell the idea that they're saving, the African continent one sort of last mile problem at a time. And it's like, well, Yes, and I'm not saying these things aren't important. I'm not saying don't solve those problems. I'm not saying don't figure out drones and stuff. But I am saying also part of why this question annoys me is because fundamentally there's some basic things um, that that need to be that need to be addressed as part of answering that question. I.e., to what account are we holding our governments to as far as like just delivering on basic infrastructure? I see the whole drones dropping plasma in the middle of remote parts of Rwanda or Malawi or whatever. I see that in Tanzania, wherever it's happening, right? I see that, and I think it's great. Except, if the person in the middle of that, of sort of rural Botswana actually needs sort of like surgery, there's no drone in the world that's going to help with that. You know what I mean?
Right.
That's going to need a road.
Totally. I agree with that.
And access. And so I suppose, so that's the other thing where it's like, why is the go-to, let's hack the fact that you can't get into some of South Africa's townships to deliver a package. Like, you realize like that wouldn't be a problem if we had roads into the area.
Right, because it's like putting a Band-Aid on the problem and not really addressing.
Yeah. So we start to fetishize tech and as this sort of weird solution to everything when sometimes the most basic things are staring us in the face. Yeah, and I think it makes us chase hype-ridden things and ignore some of the more boring pedestrian matters we need to be doing or sort of channeling our activism into as citizens, as private citizens, but also as as corporately as society. It's like, yeah, I mean, this stuff has to happen at the same time. We can't be just interested in drones or just interested in how Amazon's going to access me if I live in rural Burkina Faso. You know what I mean?
So true. Wow. Yes, and
Yeah.
I have so many questions for you, but I know we're kind of running out of time.
I know, like it's like it's an hour now. I'm like your poor audience.
I mean, this is super fascinating to me, so I really hope the audience also enjoys what you have to share. But I have to ask, so China obviously has like such a large presence like on the continent, and I actually listened to one of the podcasts you were on recently. I think it was like the China Africa podcast. Is that
China Africa project? Yes, the China Africa project. So we are doing we have a collaboration with them we just launched. So every so often we'll be collaborating with them to mash up what they're doing and what we're doing. So they do great work sort of covering the China-Africa relationship. And I think they phrased it in that way intentionally, because right now, I mean, I think China holds all the power. And then we obviously cover African tech. And then there's this interesting new genre of commercial activity on the continent that's being driven by China, which is tech specific, which we'll be looking at every so often. Working with them. So yeah, that's thanks for listening. I'm glad you listened. That's really recent, actually.
Yeah. I mean, I thought it was so cool. And just I also got to travel to China earlier this year for one of my classes, and so
nice.
Being there was just mind blowing. And I feel like surprisingly, a lot of the like just regular citizens that we talked to didn't really have like an understanding of all that's happening on the continent, all that China's doing on the continent. So I was like, obviously they're not like promoting it on TV and saying, hey, this is what we're doing over on the continent. So that was interesting. But anyway, so I wanted to just get your perspective. So like something that I heard in that podcast was like, the Chinese like play the long game, and like oftentimes they like when they come to the continent to bring some sort of like, let's say, new technology, they don't really come with too many assumptions that like a lot of like the West would typically come with. And like the example that I looked into was like the techno phones, and how those phones really were created like for the continent, because they don't sell them like in China. And so like just looking through some of the features of the phone, and I guess they make it so like there's like better, like there's a better camera for like dark skin, and longer battery life, to kind of help out with like some of like the load shedding and like power issues. And that it's got like African languages like in the phone that people can use. So I just thought that was like super fascinating, and I wanted to get like kind of your perspective on that. Like, just what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, China's done a much better job than pretty much any other single country that's looking to position around commercial opportunity in Africa. And I say position, really, I mean capture commercial value on the continent. I think they've done better than, say, the US or certain big countries in Europe and other sort of heavyweights like Japan, or even Britain in Europe. And I think the reason is there seems to be, and I mean there are a lot of reasons, but I think some of the more standout reasons, like you've mentioned, I think there might be a better cultural fit in terms of the Chinese people who come over, in terms of their willingness to sort of approach. Okay, let me think about this nicely, because I'm going to make like this hypothesis that's totally untested and might be true or something. My feeling is that everywhere I've encountered sort of Southeast Asians who sort of travel someplace new in order to sort of do business, I've found that there's always there's an outsiderness to their presence in that space that almost demands that they figure the place out before they sort of just plunge in there. Whereas I feel America and Europe typically approach most virgin, quote unquote, virgin opportunities outside of their countries as, we've figured it out in Silicon Valley or wherever, and we're going to come and sort of, create you into our own image. And I think ultimately every country that comes to Africa on some level has that attitude. We've figured things out in China, and, we can teach you a thing or two, and we can shape you into what works for us, or, into a situation that might mirror something we've done before, or something we're transitioning away from, or whatever. But the Chinese seem to have this attitude that, they seem to have an attitude of, let's arrive and figure it out. They're okay to run in stealth mode for a while and almost commit to the long game on arrival. And maybe that's cultural in some respect. That's why I say to some extent maybe there's a cultural fit that doesn't quite match the sort of sense of urgency and immediacy that you get when you typically think Silicon Valley or really anything to do with the West, where people are still thinking in sort of quarterly cycles, annual cycles. Things need to, you know what I mean? No one's really thinking in terms of like 5, 10, 15, 20 years and positioning around that. You're trying, and I think that's, people are hooked on a culture where, an announcement can sort of bump up your share price, and, an oil find in the right place on the African continent, the right size, can sort of, deliver an inflection point that can sort of land you a massive payday as a company or as an individual within an organization. And I find the Chinese don't think that way necessarily. And it might have something to do with the fact that, it's a communist government. There's a certain level of sort of certainty around what China will or won't be, politically, that, you certainly don't have that when you're dealing with Britain, given everything that's happening with Brexit, for example. You certainly don't have that with the US, where, public policy changes with, with every, new president And so, yeah, there's just something about the Chinese and their approach to Africa. And the reason I'm trying to be very careful and nuanced in how I'm sharing these ideas, and I'm really just not even filtering them as I'm sharing with them. The reason I'm doing that is because I will stop short of declaring them in some way or form like the better partner to have or the more ideal partner to have in trade terms for the African continent, or, because that's a much more complex debate or discussion we need to have about, what's good for us and why. And I think that should be determined on a case-by-case basis and not just lazily on the basis of China good, America bad, or vice versa, or, Europe good, China and its allies great, and China's not so great. I think by and large, my pragmatic take on China is, you all know how to slip in here, become, add value, create utility, observe a market, deliver what it needs, do so profitably, and then by the time people wake up, it's like, oh, it's an overnight success. No, but it's been a thing for like the better part of 15 years. At least it's been a success in the making for the better part of 15 years. And so that's kind of how I see China and what's worth, keeping a close eye on in China. Like, where else are the Chinese executing strategies of that nature? We've seen it with Transient, we've seen it with Huawei, before anyone even knew what Huawei was or had a handheld device called Huawei. Companies like ZTE that have these huge sort of infrastructure plans. It's like a myriad of like massive, people like to think of sort of Alibaba and Tencent and companies like that because they have these huge sort of consumer-facing brands, but there are a lot of enterprise brands that are quietly doing in the B2B space, applying this sort of approach without announcements, without PR releases, without major visits and fanfare, a la the US or Europe, and just quietly getting it done. So it's both interesting, but also something to watch, like for very good reason, because there are lots of reasons why you don't want that sort of thing to just quietly happen forever. Like, we need to know what's happening and keep our eyes open.
Wow. Thank you so much for that. And would you advise, let's say, folks in the diaspora who want to like invest like in the continent, would you advise they take that same approach, like kind of play the long game? Take your time, really study, what consumers want, like that sort of thing. Like, should we take that approach as well, or?
Yeah, I think the biggest investment any diasporan interested in contributing to Africa's commercial success, the biggest investment anybody who feels the urge to do that should be making is spending extended periods of time in country, connecting, understanding, right? I think I've met enough diasporans to know that, you when you're away from home long enough and, your short-term visits to the, home, wherever you consider home or back to the continent, typically leave you feeling like, oh my word, if only they knew what I knew, And if we're honest, if most diasporans are honest, and I count myself as a diasporan living in Zimbabwe, living in South Africa, you often feel like, if they just listen to me, if they just sort of let me run things a little, if they just knew what I knew, if they could just, see things my way, we could turn this country around or whatever. We all have a version of that internal narrative, which is very, 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 very unconstructive, and the notion that you can sort of dip in and out of any ecosystem, especially underdeveloped ones, resource scarce environments, and think that you are entitled to sort of engineering successful commercial ventures in those spaces, I think is naive and problematic. Yes, a free market proponent might argue, hey, it really should be as easy as that. If I've got money and interest and time and I'm willing to invest it, I should be free and able to do that. Unfortunately, that's just not how the world works. I mean, you can have all the money in the world. I can tell you now, you're not buying into the Champagne region of France. I don't care how many trillions of dollars you offer them. That's just, there are many things possible for you as an African in France. That is not one of them, and that's just a pragmatic reality, and I say that carefully because someone's going to go and prove me wrong. But my point is, if you do achieve it, it won't be by sort of just remote control, sending money to France and buying a massive interest in the Champagne region. It's because you probably even France will demand that you invest a significant time and resources and effort in understanding that market, and probably even make you learn French, frankly, before they let you get involved in a business like that. And that's just one example of an industry that I think, oftentimes we think Africa is somehow different because, our perception is we have less. The fact is we have more. And if you're genuinely interested in getting stuck in, well, you're going to need to put in those hard yards. And so, yeah, that's my take. I mean, and I'm talking like literally a year plus at a time, at least 3 or 4 months, like literally get your savings up and put yourself in a position where you can at least spend 3 months minimum in market, immersed, watching people, being immersed in everyday life of the places that you think you're going to impact, and you'll be surprised just how differently your idea of I can be of service will shift just by that exposure. So yes, that's my, and this is borrowed from a very wise man, a Dr. Shingi Munyeza, who I recently interviewed on the African Tech Roundup. He's a fairly well-respected Zimbabwean entrepreneur, and he was asked in a live setting, I was moderating, this exact question, and a lot of the things I've said are borrowed directly from him, and I happen to share his views. So there you go.
Thank you so much, Andile.
Pleasure.
Yes,
Pleasure.
I can't wait to share this conversation with
Sure.
the audience. If you would like to stay in the know and up to date about all things tech on the continent, don't forget to check out African Tech Roundup wherever you listen to podcasts, or you can visit africantechroundup.com. Thanks for listening to Dear Diaspora. If you like what you hear, subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes. You can find us on Instagram at Dear Diaspora or visit our website at deardiasporashow.com. Thank you, and talk to you next week.